afternoon, everyone. We want to have our panelists come up. We have Michel Quintas, we have Amy Musolino, and Damon Basch. I want to give them all an opportunity to take 2 minutes just to introduce themselves really quickly. And we'll start with you, Amy.
Hello, I'm Amy Musolino. I was formerly the Chief Marketing Officer for the Pharmaceutical Diagnostics Division of GE Healthcare. GE Healthcare has 2 divisions, or 4 actually, but basically 2 parts. So we have the equipment side of the business, which has all of the ultrasound and MRI machines and things like that. And then we have the diagnostic side of the business, which has all the contrast media and the radiopharmaceuticals, which are considered to be pharmaceuticals by the FDA, so fall under all of those regulations. So I'm covering that for today, the diagnostics and equipment side of the business.
Good afternoon, I'm Michel Quintas, Biogen, Global Customer Engagement. I'm responsible for supporting the affiliates globally in their digital and omni-channel plans. And I also work with the product PDCs and helping them leverage internal and external digital capabilities to achieve their business goals.
Good afternoon, I'm Damon Basch. I'm with Veradigm. Veradigm is a lot of things, but it is essentially a technology company, EHR, clinical software, a payer company. We work with payers on a lot of different levels. We'll talk about that a bit today. And then a life sciences company as well, both for marketing solutions and real-world data and real-world services. Nice to meet you all. It's a small group, so I hope we can get some Q&A going here as well today.
Thank you. So our topic today for this panel is the HCP Experience Beyond 2024. So what do we as Pharma need to know, and what do we need to do differently? So let's just jump right into a few of the questions. The first question I wanted to ask, and this goes to the entire panel, we've talked about COVID-19. We've talked about it frequently. It's always on our topics of conversation, and those long-term effects that come along with that. So on healthcare delivery. So a question that I am interested in knowing is how should we as pharmaceutical companies adjust our approach to better support our HCPs and enhance that overall HCP experience? And we'll start with you, Damon.
Well, for starters, I think we need to acknowledge that post-COVID, physicians are busier than they've ever been. Now, I can speak specifically to primary care and specialists that work in an ambulatory or clinic-based environment because that's the area where we have software that they use every day, EHR, practice management, et cetera. I can tell you pre-COVID, we were seeing about 200 million visits a year. Post-COVID now, we're seeing north of 200 million visits a year. So we're back in terms of the actual patients cycling through the practice to a pace that we saw before COVID. That's a fact. We're also seeing diagnoses for most major chronic conditions start to ramp up. We're seeing prescriptions for the drugs that treat most of these conditions naturally starting to ramp up as well. And so there's kind of a warehousing of all of the pre-COVID patients who were getting by with telehealth for refills or for things like cough, cold, but actually had diagnoses and issues that could only be diagnosed and only be dealt with in a face-to-face environment. And so it takes years for these patients to cycle through and actually see a physician, and you don't always get the right diagnosis or a diagnosis on the first visit. It's starting to catch up. At the same time, there's the pressure on the practices to meet telehealth requirements as well, above and beyond the 200 million patient visits, and to change their practices and add technology layers to meet value-based care models in order to prove that they're following evidence-based guidelines and they're working with the payers to look for risk adjustment and quality improvement and gaps in care. So there's that component as well. And with all of these new patients and all of this volume, they have to process PAs. They have all these manual workflows that they have to support as well. You know, the physician practice spends on average 8 hours a week just on prior authorization. More medications, more expensive medications means more prior authorization. So as marketers, we need to understand that physicians are extremely pressed for time. And when we do connect with them, whether it's a rep-enabled type of connectivity or it's digital enablement, we need to make sure we're giving them resources that are data-driven, that are germane to a specific clinical errand, where we're able to do that, or to their specialty or to the behavior of their practice. And so when we look at omnichannel marketing, or marketing, I guess we heard earlier, we're going to talk about data a little bit, but it's really important that we use that to make sure that we're supporting the physician rather than just spraying information to them and hoping that it's being assimilated in the way that we want it to.
Anyone else want to add?
I think in my experience, what I've seen is that a lot of physicians, as you mentioned, are overwhelmed. And maybe to add to your comment, there's actually even less doctors seeing patients. So it kind of amplifies the shortage that we're seeing. But what I've experienced is that, physicians are physicians because they want to help people, and they're there for that reason. And from what I've experienced, is that they're looking for a lot of patient information. So they may not have the time to be able to sit down, and we saw that the ChatGPT is more empathetic than a physician from patients' perspectives. But, they're looking for tools that can help them with their patients once they're on medication, get them on medication, and be on medication. And at Biogen, we've actually worked on, how do you help them with the prior authorization? How do we leverage our internal digital capabilities to help them with that process? If you're going to go on a Tecfidera or another MS drug, how can you log on to the Biogen website and have that done easily for you to help cut down on that administrative hours and burden?
So it's interesting about the COVID-19 pandemic because prior to being at GE Healthcare, I had been at IQVIA, and during COVID-19, we had been tracking pretty closely the impact of COVID-19 on patients going in to their doctors specifically to be diagnosed for different diseases that were not life-threatening. So what we saw was that specifically on oncology, there was not a drop in patients going in for routine checkups that would often lead to a diagnosis of certain diseases and so forth. And we expected that once COVID-19 let up, we would see a huge spike in patients returning to the doctor's office and therefore being diagnosed with later stage disease states than would have been picked up had they been going to see their primary care physicians at earlier stages. And I do think that that did play out in a lot of sense. We did see at GE Healthcare a significant increase in the number of cardiovascular disease, larger numbers of CT scans, and other types of diagnostic treatments post-COVID. So part of the post-COVID-19 pandemic and the long-term effects, I think, has weighed heavily on earlier detection and diagnosis of longer-term health issues. And we've also seen a shift as well in diagnostic imaging in terms of the use of AI in enhanced imaging. So where you are seeing AI, and not from a marketing perspective necessarily, but where we are seeing AI being used much earlier in healthcare is actually in the interpretation of imaging. So it's a really interesting area where we're actually seeing the pharmaceutical industry start to lead in the market in terms of leveraging AI and large databases of images to be able to earlier predict and help radiologists to better interpret the data and identify where potentially there's a tumor or where there's an earlier disease state. So it's helping them to better detect potentially earlier disease. And so I think that's a really interesting utilization of AI in the pharmaceutical industry, and that's something that's just pretty recent in our industry.
Thanks. So, we've been talking about data. We've talked about how do we use data analytics. It's a continual conversation, and it has been for a while, and I think it will continue to figure out ways to improve the way we use data. But my question is, when we're thinking about how we use data analytics and how it intersects with that HCP experience, talk to me a little bit about your thoughts on that. What's that interaction between the data that we have and how it improves or changes that HCP experience? And we'll start with you, Michel.
Great. I I guess there's a lot to unpack, I think, with this kind of a question. I think the first step, the challenge, at least from a Biogen perspective, is that we do not have a lot of consents, especially with some of the new therapeutic categories that we're going into. So you think you have a rare disease company that's focused on MS, spinal muscular atrophy, that is now going into postpartum depression as well as Alzheimer's. Now, these are completely new doctors, physicians that you've never dealt with before. And so how do you develop, a one-on-one relationship with these individuals when you don't have their consent to communicate with them? And then this becomes even more of an issue because in the US, at least, you can purchase the data. But when you're dealing with countries outside of the US, this becomes a major, major hurdle. So I think that, data, technology, consent is critical in order for us to start developing that relationship. I touched on it earlier on before that the digital relationship oftentimes is predicate on the face-to-face engagement. Obviously we see that rep-driven emails tend to have a much higher open rate than broadcast emails. So I think that, first of all, it's critical that we get the doctors in our data sets, we get their consent, and then we start using that information to try to tailor the message. And I think what's important for us to note is that we talk about one-on-one messaging, but I do honestly believe that given the restraints that we face, it's very challenging to do that. And I think that we need to segment our physicians, understand who they are, what value do they bring, and find different ways of engaging with them. So a KOL definitely would get a face-to-face and a digital, but whereas a referrer would probably just get a standard disease education or brand message.
Would anyone else like to add?
Sure. So I'll give a two-part answer because I'll look at this from the perspective of point of care and the provider experience and how data and AI is changing the way that they run their practices. But then also as marketers, we need to think about that as well. And on the marketing side, some of it is obvious. The ad tech, the MarTech technology that we had on the consumer side is now catching up on the professional side at breakneck speed. And we have the identity graphing, we have the device graphing to understand a physician journey from when they're watching television to when they're actually in a clinical environment. And we have claims data and other data assets to bump up against to find out if what we're doing is the right thing to do, if there's a next best action that we should be considering, sequential messaging. And so from that standpoint, data and technology is coming together to play for marketers in a way that it's never been able to before. It's important to understand how the physicians are interacting, I think, in the clinical workflow and what AI is changing for them in order to understand how you should be thinking about product development and marketing to them in those environments. So, when we look at AI at Veradigm, there are certain areas, well, really, it's customer-driven enhancements. It's our doctor saying to us, this is our pain point, fix it, please. It's not pharma coming to us saying, we have a solution in search of a problem. And I think that's an important disconnect that really needs to be resolved. The providers drive enhancements in the workflow. So we look at things like large language models for unstructured data in the notes field. We look about how we can work with that data for real-world data solutions, but also for clinical decision support. If you have a product that's diagnosed for moderate to severe, an ICD code won't say whether it's moderate to severe. However, unstructured data will. And so we're looking at ways to work with the data to build better audience quality and to feed that into programmatic activation and other machines that can use that for targeting in a more meaningful, more appropriate way. Physicians are looking to us for AI tools around medical scribing so they can actually, God forbid, look at a patient instead of looking at their EHR. They're looking for AI to help with coding so they get fewer denials, or they can probabilistically determine whether or not they're going to get denied, or they can file an appeal more readily, or they can make sure that there's accuracy in what they're reporting. So it's prior authorization, again, understanding that it's not going to get denied. So those are the areas that physicians are looking to us to help them with. Also, hub connectivity, enrolling patients, getting them connected to patient assistance programs, care coordination, all of those friction points at the point of care where you see drop-off, where you lose patients because of cost, because of lack of connectivity to resources, because you can't get them activated, because the physician doesn't know about a resource. You can think about the same thing for clinical trials. a site activation for patients, for physicians who are research naive, and all of their pool of patients where we can use natural language processing and AI to identify use cases where a patient is ideal to be part of a clinical trial. So that's how we look at the world on the clinical side of things. And the question is, how can pharma play in that way that it is complementary to the clinical errand of the physician and the patient that they're seeing? Again, not spray and pray, but a data-driven intervention based upon where the physician is at that point in time.
Great. So, and just in thinking about, we talked about AI, we talked about where do we feel like it's going? So when we're thinking about how we're going to use AI in the future and how we're going to continue to improve, any thoughts on where we're going and what improvements are coming? And with that, that's referring to both the HCP and the patient experience. Any thoughts, anyone?
I don't want to hog the mic.
I mean, if we just think about it as a blank slate, I think that would be interesting to kind of open up to the broader group. But I mean, there's so many possibilities, right? Because I think of it from a marketing perspective. I do think that we were pretty probably behind GE Healthcare. I'm sure most of the pharma industry may be further ahead from us, but just an integration or an interconnection between all the marketing platforms so that we had one centralized place where we could see how the HCP was intersecting or touching all of the different pieces of content that we were offering into the marketplace so that we could understand kind of what was interesting to them or how they were interacting with what we were putting out. So looking at that from just a marketing perspective, I think if you look at from a customer service perspective, having an automated customer service, or if we were able to, on the MarTech side, have some kind of automated persona tagging so that we could better map the customer journey and potentially integrate content along the customer journey in a more automated fashion. That would be something that I think would be really compelling, and then we could almost map it along the customer journey and kind of see how content was better utilized or how effective it was in pulling the customer along the path to from consideration ultimately to purchase. So those are things that I thought from a marketing pure perspective were pretty interesting. And then there's always kind of the natural language interpretation. I know there's tools out there now where you can kind of monitor the web and see if customers are talking about your products, and you can kind of see what they're saying about your products, which can often sometimes be dangerous as well from a compliance and regulatory perspective, but also being able to intersect and kind of see how customers or physicians are talking about your products. And then even stretching that further, is there a way for HCPs to kind of have a real-time interaction if they needed to ask a question or have a Q&A session amongst each other in terms of, hey, I have this question I want to ask other colleagues about a therapy or a contrast media or a diagnostic or so forth. So those were just some of the things that I had kind of brainstormed or come up with in terms of what's possible. When I look at data analytics, I always kind of think of how do we educate the HCPs in terms of how do we collect all that information once the therapy or the diagnostic goes into the real world, in terms of how is it performing against the disease state by demographic, race, sex, how is it, what's the real world data capture, do we have remote monitoring devices, what's our HEOR data, are the hospital quality reporting data that's out there, how can we share that across the network so that people can be smarter about their hospital systems compared to other hospital systems, and patients can be smarter and doctors can be smarter. So all of that kind of information, I think, will ultimately become more readily available and will hopefully drive better quality across the entire healthcare ecosystem.
Thanks.
Yeah, just to build on your comment, I think that within the marketing discipline, we need to do a much better job of leveraging AI in order to, next best action. If a physician does A, do they get B or C based on their behavior? Use that to learn what messages are working, which messages are not working. And you can obviously do the same with patients once you start engaging with them. I find that also we have used AI in the past, or starting to use it more in terms of analyzing claims data and understanding which physicians, which areas, which markets have higher incidence of diseases, but also understanding what are other symptomatics that may be related to that specific disease to help identify, okay, this is an area we should probably be focusing on. So are they on a symptomatic for Alzheimer's, or to take a look at that. And so I think that there's a lot of opportunities there.
Great.
Yeah, and there'll be more of that type of data for you to analyze, because you're talking about claims, but now we're harmonizing social determinants of health, mortality data, other data assets, and then there are a lot of changes in the health IT space related to interoperability that are going to drive integration of data that we've never had at scale before, and the ability to connect hospital data with clinical data, FHIR standards, FHIR, if you're not familiar with that, which allows the development of apps and resources that can be pushed into clinical platforms to enhance the experience of the physician and drive better decisioning, drive more information, hopefully drive adherence, better patient education as well. So there are going to be swarms of new data assets that need to be harmonized, connected, and used as marketers in the not too distant future. Some of it is AI driven and some of it is standards driven. CMS determines the standards for interoperability between different health IT platforms. That's here, and it's only going to get stronger. And one of the roles that marketers can play is to help fund some of this. And so none of this is free. If you're pushing data, shipping it back and forth, somebody has to pay that bill. There's a lot of value for it. And I can tell you that physicians will pay as much as you ask them for new features and functionality as long as it's free. It has to be free. So the people in this room are the people who are going to finance innovation, which will enhance the transferability, the utility of data today, but also new forms of data and greater forms of data at scale. And it's important to get in front of that, understand how to ingest that data, and how to make use of it for your marketing objectives and your clinical objectives as well. So it's not necessarily AI, but it's connected to the issue of interoperability, health IT, and data.
Great. So we have one more question I want to ask before we open it up to Q&A. And thinking about our role as marketers, one thing I think that we will always do is we try to make sure we're making it easier for our customers. We want to take some of the burden off their plate so that they can think clearly about what they want to do for their patients. And so just in thinking about the future, thinking about where we're going, how might we as pharma work on that relationship between pharma and providers and giving that experience, helping them to improve that experience so they can be more focused on their patients, and ultimately thinking about what's different between the current state and where we plan on going and where we would like to go moving forward. And we'll start with you, Amy. Or we'll start with you, David. I'm sorry. I would start out.
Well, all I can say is, a clinic-based physician is going to see 18 to 22 patients a day. They use their platforms at night. They use them on the weekends, the same way we use our own platforms. They're looking at their schedule for the next day. Why? Partially because they want to find out who's walking through the exam room the next day, but they're looking to find out when they get to go to the bathroom, when they get to eat lunch. Walmart just announced that they closed 51 primary care stores because guess what? It's hard. It's expensive. Reimbursement laws make it difficult. All of these doctors, maybe not on the hospital side or in certain specialties, but they're working on razor-thin margins. They need support. They need help. They don't have access to resources to understand how value-based models are changing. If a patient doesn't get on therapy, if they're not adherent, well, guess what? That impacts how they get paid. So I think the people in this room have an obligation in the future, first to understand how challenging it is to do what these doctors do, but to give them tools that will reduce the friction around providing care, whether that means giving them tools in the office or whether that means giving them resources to give to the patient when they leave. So if you're able to do that, it will be a quality conversation with the physician related to your brand, and then obviously everybody wins. That's the triple aim.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. Based on the physicians that I know, a lot of them are looking at getting out of being physicians because they're overwhelmed. They don't have enough time. They feel underappreciated. They get abused by patients and caregivers. And we need to find ways to make working for them easier.
Yeah.
So do we need to engage with, access earlier on in the process? And how does, access and reimbursement get involved in our activities moving forward? But also we need to make sure that we align with the business. So we need to understand the business objectives. What are we trying to achieve? And then we need to make sure that they're aligned with what the customers want. But I agree that, we need to find ways to make their jobs easier because it's not going to get any easier.
So before we wrap up, are there any initial questions for the audience? And if not, I have a question that I would like to pose to each of you.
Yeah, does anybody want to hop in? Yes.
I'm not in marketing, so forgive me if this question is naive. But is there any marketing being done with the large language model as the target?
If I'm understanding what you're asking, I can give you one use case of what we're doing here. So we're taking all of the unstructured data from EHR and we're structuring it. It's a huge amount of data, so we can't do it all at once. AI is helping, but we're doing therapeutic cuts, neurology, metabolic, diabetes, et cetera. And then we're using that data for both clinical and real-world data applications, helping physicians make clinical decisions, but also adding that to the mix for marketing decisions, but also for health economics and outcomes research. I'm not sure if I'm getting at the root of your question, but we are using AI and unstructured information to drive new solutioning for marketing applications and for clinical. Is that what you were asking?
Well, more so if everyone is asking AI for help in figuring out the best thing to choose for whatever, perhaps one of the targets should be the large language model to have an informed decision on what it should recommend when a physician is asking or a patient is asking what treatment.
It's like Total Recall. It's yeah.
I mean, that's an interesting question because if the chats are pulling from the internet and you're advertising and you're optimizing your SEO strategy, then it would inherently pull your content from the internet if you have your keywords optimized, I would think, to some degree.
Anyone else want to chime in before we move on to our next session? Yes.
There was some conversation about this over lunch, but so I think one of the key takeaways of what everybody's on stage is saying is that HCP marketing is about making their job less demanding. So one of the most demanding parts of being a physician is driving adherence, especially for something like a daily pill. And yet, a lot of HCPs and nursing staff seem to be resistant to patient support programs that are sponsored by pharmaceutical brands. So I was wondering if you could just comment a little bit on that dichotomy and what to do, what you would do as a marketer in that instance.
So I can jump in. I've heard that sometimes it's a little more challenging because, like you said, the providers are a little less open to using those type of options sponsored by pharmaceutical companies. I think with that, the way I look at it is you have to make it easy, you have to make it simple, and ensure that the HCPs and the office staff understand that our goal is to support them and their patients. It's not to benefit ourselves, it's not to make our jobs easier or make our jobs to do. To me, it's more so how do we make sure that we're letting these offices and providers know that our job is to support them and our job is to support our patients and explaining how it's going to benefit them. And so to me, that's telling your sales reps about to have total office calls, to explaining to everyone in the office who will ever touch the patient or touch their assistance programs to help them to understand the benefits and help them to understand the why behind what we're doing so that it can avoid that idea that we have ulterior motives from a pharma standpoint.
So I don't know the answer to this because this isn't my remit at all. It's more of a question, I guess. But what if you bypassed the HCP and asked the pharmacy to provide that information to the patient for the reminders, like a text reminder to take it, and you didn't even ask the HCP to do it at all?
I think it's both. I think having those conversations or having adherence programs where we're including the pharmacy as well as the office staff, I think those two are the biggest areas where we have to, because they work hand in hand already. And so knowing that they work hand in hand and knowing that they are both there to do the same thing for that patient, to me, having those conversations with both and providing them with the right information can help.
You know, I think from my perspective, I think it's predicate on us to try to understand why. I'm sure you're going to have detractors, you're going to have advocates. Why are the advocates advocates? Why are the detractors detractors? And why are they not using the patient support programs that are available? Yeah. And they might have some insights and information that can help us. So that's my initial thought. I agree with you in terms of it could be the physician, it could be the pharmacist, right? But I also think there's a lot of patients that want to take care of their own treatment. So then what are then the services that we provide as a pharma and a biotech to these patients so that they can then also be responsible for their own health care? Like, I don't know about here in some of these markets, but it is quite the challenge to go and see a doctor. You have to make an appointment weeks in advance. Pharmacists are a lot easier to access and see. But if you can go online and you get taught how to go online to get the information on your medication, I think that there's an opportunity there. So,
I know we're short on time, but have you been to a doctor's office and seen what a terminal looks like where they're trying to onboard patients to a hub? Have you seen the forms that have 5 signatures from the provider and 6 signatures from the patient? Nurses and care coordinators actually, they copy stuff on a Xerox machine, they email it to themselves on Gmail unencrypted, and then they attach documents and send it to the hub. The hub can be 5-6 pages long, populated with details that invariably are gotten wrong, which cause the hub or the support services to have to call the practice back, take more time, correct information, and resubmit. We talked about pulling friction and burden out of the workflow for the physician. It's not that they don't like hub services. Patient assistance and financial savings is one of the most important services that they get from pharma and appreciate. It's all of the friction and noise in the system to get information from point A to point B, including permissioning and including all of the content from the charts. So there's a swivel chair. They go from one portal to the next, from Cigna to United, each one with different passcodes. They deal with different people. They get things wrong. They get phone calls. They're literally emailing to themselves, completely unencrypted, not safe, not HIPAA compliant. We need to figure out a way to make it work better. And I think if you do that, you'll see that resistance start to dwindle because it'll be seamless and organic rather than a process that is painful beyond.
Okay, let's give Jay, Amy, Michel, and Damon a round of applause. A wonderful discussion there. So we're just going to do a quick